Dr. Dorff is a professor in the Department of Medical Oncology and Therapeutics Research at the City of Hope. She's also the division chief of the Genitourinary Disease Program at City of Hope. She's internationally recognized. She's an internationally recognized leader in prostate cancer and is renowned for her work in other genitourinary tumor types, including kidney, bladder, and penile cancer. Dr. Dorff graduated from the UCLA School of Medicine and completed her internal medicine residency at Mount Sinai in New York. And she finished her subspecialty training in hematology and oncology at Los Angeles and USC Medical Center. Dr. Dorff is here to talk to us today about clinical trials, by which she is heavily involved in the design and conduct of trials in immunotherapy and exploring treatment combinations. She's also worked on a lot of clinical trials examining lifestyle and treatment side effects. She's actually assumed control of one of the largest clinical trial portfolios in genitourinary cancers and treats patients with all types of genitourinary cancers, including testicular and penile cancer. So she has made herself available to us today. She'll be sharing some slides and talking about general education about clinical trials. But if you do have specific questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dorff.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And yeah, unfortunately, I guess my specialty ends up being that I treat a lot more men as patients than women, but I think it's wonderful that you all are here, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have. So let me share my screen. And put it in presenter mode. Okay, are you able to see it?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. It usually doesn't work, like the screen's flipped, so this is great. So I did not make these slides, but they're actually very good for talking about clinical trials. It was really designed for a variety of physicians to be able to talk to support groups, because there are really a lot of questions and misconceptions about clinical trials. I do some work with pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, some of our clinical trials are funded by them, and are their trials. Others we write ourselves and are funded through, private grants like Prostate Cancer Foundation or the federal government like NIH and CI. So those are my disclosures. So clinical trials are really why I get up in the morning. They're my passion and why I went into oncology, because every day I want to have more options for patients and be able to give them better treatments than what I can give them today. So I always tell my patients who are in clinical trials that they're my heroes, because it can be scary, right? Cancer in and of itself is already very daunting, and we do have treatments that work. But again, we're always just trying to do better. And so by joining this talk tonight, by going to other meetings, you're doing exactly, one of the most important things you can do, which is equipping yourself with as much information as possible. A clinical trial may not be the right choice. I do have patients where I tell them, I don't think you should do the trial. I think you should do standard treatment. But the more educated you are about your cancer, about your treatment team, about clinical trial options, then the better equipped you are to make these very difficult decisions. So I always tell my patients also that the reason I'm treating them is so that they can live their lives and do the amazing things they do. So we always try to work around the lifestyle, meetings, appointments, goals, travel, family events that patients have, and try to fit the treatment around them rather than the opposite. Like I really dislike when my patients cancel a trip because they feel like they need to come in and get their treatment on time. I think it's important to have a balance, but we want you to be living your best life. So clinical trials are evaluating new treatments or approaches. Sometimes they are designed to get a new treatment FDA approved, and sometimes they're just exploring whether a different way of using a treatment might result in better efficacy or fewer side effects. So there are really a wide variety of clinical trials. And a lot of people think of them as only the last thing you do. You go through all the standard things and then you look for a clinical trial. That's really not the case. Clinical trials are sometimes looking for prevention or early detection or better ways to cure early stage cancer. So they're not always something that you only look for if you have a very advanced and refractory kind of a cancer. So these days, cancer survival is better, and clinical trials are really part of that. I can speak personally. When I started treating prostate cancer patients 15 years ago, I had two tools. I had hormone therapy and I had chemotherapy. And my patients didn't live as long and they didn't live as well as they live now. But we had patients enrolling on the clinical trials that got many of the new drugs approved that now help all of my prostate cancer patients live much longer and much better. So without enrollment on clinical trials, we get no new treatments. And I really think this contributes significantly to how much better our cancer patients are doing today. So the president of ASCO, which is our big American Society for Clinical Oncology, it's this society we all belong to, we go to the meetings, says again that we can't make this progress without clinical trials and cancer research. And that is for you, but it's also by you. And we recognize that it's a huge personal kind of investment and gift that you give yourself and the future when you enroll in a clinical trial. So melanoma, you know, with Jimmy Carter having been cured with brain metastasis, right? Really a huge shift because of clinical trials that led to the development of immunotherapy. And the Nobel Prize was awarded to Jim Allison, who discovered the immune aspect that we modulate with drugs like nivolumab, Opdivo, and ipilimumab, Yervoy, these immune checkpoints. So in melanoma, which used to have no treatments and had a dismal survival, now patients can live many years, which is a really nice shift. My own mother was diagnosed with a very fatal form of leukemia when I was 18, and she got an experimental treatment, although not on a clinical trial. I think it was sort of like in that compassionate access window. And it turned her uniformly fatal leukemia into something that is now very curable. And so she's alive, 30 years later. And that's part of why I'm passionate about clinical trials, because I see that without that, unfortunately, I would have had decades less with my mom. So I believe in clinical trials. I know they can feel like we're experimenting, but we really try to have very good science and reasoning behind every clinical trial we do. And a big issue in a wonderfully diverse country like the United States is that if we only do clinical trials in some kinds of people, we don't know how well the treatments will work for everyone. We can say that about cancers like lung cancer or bladder cancer, where there can be male patients and female patients. If we only treat men, how can we be sure these treatments will work for women, or vice versa? If only women go on the trial, how will we know that the treatment works for men? And the same is true when it comes to racial diversity, especially when we think about oral medications, pills, people's diets, people's microbiome. There are lots of things that can impact how well a drug is absorbed, how they metabolize it can be due to their genetics, and that can really differ among different populations. So there's a big emphasis on trying to make sure that we offer our clinical trials to everyone, regardless of who they are, what population they belong to. And there's, historically been some mistrust because bad ethical trials happened in the past, but really, I think they don't happen today. There's very rigorous review. Patients like yourself or other people who have been affected by cancer can sit on IRBs that review clinical trials and give the patient voice and say whether they think the study is valuable to patients or whether it feels like something they would participate in. We have patient advocates actually in our cooperative group system where we do big phase 3 1,000 patient practice changing clinical trials. We always have patient advocates tell us, like, they keep us real. Is this a trial that makes sense to you? Is it a trial that feels ethical? Do you feel like you would want to take part, and would the results be important to you? But there are other reasons besides mistrust. Clinical trials ask a lot of people sometimes. They require more visits. And so if people have to work full time, if they have requirements of taking care of children or grandchildren, then sometimes they simply can't. And we're really working on reducing the burden to patients for participating in clinical trials, especially people who live outside of urban areas. It can just mean a lot of travel. And if there are frequent visits, that can be really challenging. So we're starting to think more and more about these things and making it less burdensome to join a clinical trial. So I think we already talked a little bit about minority inclusion and about the importance of clinical trials. So I don't know if any of you have been on a clinical trial or have been offered, right? Why do only 4% of adult cancer patients participate? Well, it starts with us. If we don't offer a clinical trial, then you can't participate. So hopefully when you're talking to your doctor, when you need a new treatment or a change in treatment, hopefully they're thinking not only about what's standard, but what trials are out there, and is that a good move at this juncture or not? So many of us think that the best cancer care that someone can get is on a trial. You know, I truly believe that. I believe if I were diagnosed with cancer, I would want to know what's the clinical trial, because that tells me what all the greatest minds in the country think is not only the current status of what the best treatment is, but what the future state could look like. And again, clinical trials are highly vetted. We cannot just pluck an idea out of a scientist's brain and put it into human beings. There's so many steps and so many eyes look at it to make sure that what we're doing carries a strong enough probability of benefit and a low enough probability of risk that it is ethical and appropriate to enroll patients. And our understanding of science, the biology of cancer, has accelerated so much that whereas in the past clinical trials, they just kind of looked in the lab at what would kill a cancer cell and then wrote a trial. We don't do that now. We really have much more sophisticated ways to say what's different about this cancer cell compared to the normal cell, and then try to design treatments very specifically to impact those processes. And so we have much higher success rates even in our earlier phase clinical trials these days, because they're designed with so much scientific background. So phase 1 is the first time in humans. Sometimes it's the first time 2 drugs are being used together that are actually both FDA approved, right? There are different phase 1 trials. But we often think of it as, the first in human dose finding, where we have what we think is a good treatment, but we need to figure out what doses are good and effective and safe, and what kinds of side effects to expect. So this says it's usually a small group, but actually we're about to publish a phase 1 trial where we treated more than 150 patients, because we were seeing that it could work against the cancer, but we were seeing side effects, and we just kept tweaking the way we were giving the doses and the medicines around the dosing to try to reduce the side effects so that we could get that anti-cancer effect without all the side effects. So it ended up being a very big phase 1, and that does happen. Sometimes treatments now skip from phase 1 right to phase 3 because we figure it all out in the phase 1. So theoretically, when you read an informed consent for a phase 1 trial, it's going to say that the goal of the study is to determine the side effects and the right dose of the drug, and not to see how effective it is. However, we are always looking for a signal, right? We're not just going to take something that's safe but didn't work in anybody in the phase 1 and move that into phase 2. So we are looking for efficacy. We do try to choose dosing even in the earliest phase 1 trial that we think will be effective. And sometimes then we roll in the phase 2 into the phase 1. Once we figure out what is a good dose or dosing strategy, then we'll expand at that rather than opening a new phase 2 trial, which is why phase 1 trials have gotten bigger. But when I do have a phase 2 trial, I often tell my patients this is the sweet spot because we've figured out the dose and everyone's going to get the drug. Because in phase 3, we usually have to go head to head and compare the new treatment against something else. So in phase 2, everyone gets the drug. They all get it at the same dose usually. Sometimes there are 2 different doses or something like that, but everyone's getting the drug. And all we're doing is adding up and saying, 75% of people responded, 30% of people had this side effect. And then we decide whether that's good enough to go to phase 3. So in phase 3, this is usually a comparative trial. It's usually much bigger. And usually instead of just looking at how many patients respond, we're actually starting to look at how long people live. So they're bigger trials, they're longer trials. And people think of phase 3 as having a placebo, which sometimes there is, but many times these days, we don't need a placebo because we have so many treatments already that when we're trying to get a new one approved, we're trying to go head to head against a treatment that we're already using. So you'll find that phase 3 trials these days are often new drug versus drug that you would get if you did not participate in the trial. So to me, that's kind of a win-win. You're either going to get what you would get without being on the trial, or you might have access to what could become the next standard of care. Sometimes the phase 3 trial is the drug you would get outside of the clinical trial, right? The standard of care, with or without something added to it. So that's one way that we build upon prior success. If drug X works for 50% of people, and in the phase 3, we compare drug X alone versus drug X plus new drug Y, and we're hoping to get to 70% of people having benefit, right? So sometimes a phase 3 is really adding upon standard drugs. Phase 4, we don't hear so much about. This is often once a drug's been approved, if FDA just wants to gather a little bit more data in like more of a real world, like everyday patients, because the patients that go into clinical trials are often sort of the healthiest, the most educated, have the best organ function, and they meet all these high standards that once a drug's FDA approved and we're using it in real clinical settings, patients don't always look like the ones in the clinical trial. So FDA likes to get some data, make sure it's performing well once it gets rolled out into the broader community. So any questions? I know we've covered a lot about the nuts and bolts of clinical trials.
We have one question about how do we find a trial?
It is so hard to find a clinical trial. It really is. And I can't tell you the number of smart, enterprising people who have seen that problem and have come to me saying, I'm launching a company or a website or a service to help fix this problem, to help match cancer patients to clinical trials, because it's really hard. So some of it comes down to the doctor. Your doctor should ideally know what clinical trials are happening that are in your neighborhood. And if they don't know, they should feel comfortable calling someone like me and asking, hey, do you have anything in clinical trials that's good for a patient whose cancer is doing this, on this treatment? So your doctor is your first resource. And I think it's okay to ask them when they're recommending a treatment, just to say, hey, are there any trials that we should be considering? And when we live in a place like Los Angeles, if I don't have a good trial, I might reach out to my colleague at UCLA and send a patient there. It's not that I want to send my patient away, but I want them to get the best possible treatment. And sometimes if I don't have it, and another center in Los Angeles does, I'm going to send them. And I think all doctors should be held to that standard. We should all want that you get the best treatment. So your doctor's number one. Number two is clinicaltrials.gov. They have gotten easier and easier to search on clinicaltrials.gov. I think there's been a lot of effort in making it a more user-friendly website than it used to be. So you put in what kind of cancer you have, let's say pancreatic cancer, and you can search by location now so that you're not finding out what trials are happening in England and China, where you're not going to pick up and go there, but what trials are happening in the Los Angeles area. So that's number two. Number one is your doctor. Number two is clinicaltrials.gov. And number three, I would say, is really support groups and patient kind of communication, whether it's like websites or group chats or whatever these days. But sometimes just asking other patients, because some patients really look and find and then can be a good resource. All right, any other?
I haven't seen any other questions come through.
Okay, great.
We've got a question.
Okay.
I'm 14 years cancer-free, 74 years old. I received a letter from UCLA, Semel Institute, Cousins Center for Psychoneuroimmunology, announcing a research study funded by NIH and National Institute of Aging. Sounds like more of a, oh, here we go. They said that they'd be contacting me about participation. I think there's more coming.
If it's easier to unmute and say it rather than type, you can.
But they haven't heard from them yet. Should they contact them or wait?
If you have a way to contact them, I would reach out, especially if it's something that you'd be willing to do and interested in participating in. Hopefully they gave you a phone number or an email.
Okay.
Sounds like there was no contact information given.
Yes, actually, I did just see a phone number in there.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes our clinical trial teams are really understaffed. I know for one of my most important clinical trials with engineered T cells, I was trying to manage sort of the wait list on my own. And, you know, in the meantime, I'm taking care of all my patients. And so I didn't always have time to really look and call and keep in touch. So we do our best, but we don't always have all the resources we would like. And so maybe they reached out and then just didn't have the opportunity to follow up. So it'd be great if you can call.
Okay, it looked legit from UCLA, so.
Oh, yeah, but that's a good point. I guess, you know, you want to do your due diligence when you call, make sure that they don't give them any sort of personal information without making sure you feel comfortable that you know who you're talking to and what they're going to be doing in the research study.
Thank you.
Along those lines, Dr. Dorff, I'm sure there's a range. How much do these clinical trials cost? When you're talking about resources and I'm thinking about funding staff, I can only imagine. You were saying that clinical trials aren't just ideas that come out of doctors' back pockets. I imagine all the work that goes into it must be very expensive as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really quantify, I guess, because there's so many steps involved. When we apply for a grant to fund a clinical trial, you know, some of it depends on how complex the clinical trial is, but it's many, many thousands of dollars per patient, just in terms of the staff and doing the testing that we need. You know, we do CAT scans or PET scans, we do blood draws while patients are on clinical trials. Some of it gets billed to the insurance company and paid for by the insurance because it's stuff that would be happening anyway. So let's say outside of the clinical trial, you'd be getting a CAT scan every 3 months. Well, so if we're doing a CAT scan every 3 months on the clinical trial, then we can bill the insurance for that. But all this stuff that we're doing that's special has to be paid for by the clinical trial. So some of those things like PET scans can be very expensive. So, you know, how much each clinical trial costs is very different depending on how frequently we're drawing blood or doing scans, how much of that is being paid for by the trial. And then it's just the staff, that nurse who makes sure you get your appointments and makes sure that if you have a side effect, they can call you and talk you through what to do, and you know, all the other team behind the scenes that are working on the clinical trial. So there's a lot of humans that are being, whose time is being paid for by the clinical trial.
I appreciate that feedback, especially for the participant that we have that might be looking into whether or not to participate, asking questions like that. What kind of support will be with me along the way?
Yeah, I mean, the hope is that the cost does not get transferred to the patient. In fact, some clinical trials even try to reimburse patients for like their time. So if I had, for instance, a study where we were looking at cognitive function, because some people get some brain fog, right? Some short-term memory issues or whatever the case may be while they're on one of our treatments. And we were actually comparing 2 different treatments and trying to see if one did less of it than the other. So we had patients come in and do like 4 hours of cognitive testing, you know, drawing the clock and writing the sentence, but, you know, beyond that. And so that clinical trial actually gave patients, you know, a gift card for every visit that they came to, just in acknowledgement that you're donating your time. And we obviously can't fully pay for the time, but we want to try to show you our appreciation. So some trials will do that. Some sponsors will help pay for like travel costs or hotel costs if you have to spend the night close by City of Hope because your trial needs you to do some testing one day and then the treatment the next day and you can't drive back and forth. So we try not to translate the cost to the patients, but every once in a while, like if you have a copay to come see me at City of Hope and you're on a trial, you're still going to have that copay. So there can be some costs. So it is something to think about. What are the costs for me to participate? Are there any, you know, benefits to me and that sort of thing?
And I have another question here. We have a participant with us who is no evidence of disease. They have a rare but not uncommon cancer recurrence of dermal metastatic breast cancer. Treatment is going well with Ibrance and letrozole, but they're wondering, should they be interested in a clinical trial?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do have people reach out to me sometimes who are on a good treatment and it's working. And we usually don't have a clinical trial for those patients because it would be really hard to know whether something we would do differently at that point would make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's better to be on a treatment that works and not need a clinical trial for sure.
And then another question by the same participant. Many of our participants are very generous and often want to give back. Where should we be putting our donation money towards cancer research? Do you have any suggestions? As you know, there's so many different organizations that we can donate to. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, that's a lovely, lovely question. I mean, obviously, the scientists here at City of Hope put donations to very good use. I'll give an example. One of my patients has kindly donated money, and that has allowed us to open a clinical trial and start treating patients while we're waiting for grant funding to come through to fund the rest of it. But the trial would have been delayed a year or two, except this patient's donation has helped us open it and start treating patients right away. Also, it helps our scientists take leaps. If they have an idea and they need to do some work in their lab to show that their idea is a good one before they can apply for a grant, the money that people donate to City of Hope goes to scientists who are coming up with new ideas and testing them. But we're not the only institution, obviously. So other cancer centers, places like UCLA or USC, the donations do work similarly. They really go right into the research that's happening. outside of cancer centers, there are foundations. So ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, runs what's called the Conquer Cancer Foundation, and they support cancer researchers, usually early stage in their career, where it's harder to get grants and harder to get your work off the ground. So that's a very good one. They have funds for women doctors who traditionally don't get the grants as well as the men doctors. They call it Women Who Conquer Cancer. It's a lovely program, and some really fantastic research has come out of that. So that's ASCO, Conquer Cancer Foundation. And then for prostate, there's Prostate Cancer Foundation, which does amazing work. They find the best science and they fund it. I'm sure breast cancer has a similar, like Susan Komen, maybe. I'm not as familiar with those.
Thank you. I'll drop some of those into the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So push it. Hello?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I have a question and a comment. First of all, I had breast cancer twice. That's the comment. And unfortunately, City of Hope let me go too long with the lump, putting me off. So I did find a surgeon that would freeze it. So, but I was too late for the trial. So that's another thing. If you wait too long, and then they let me wait too long, they wouldn't do it. So anyway, I was too late, so I had to pay. But if it wasn't that big, then it would have been free. So that's something to think of too. And then my other question is, I have a different disease, and I was going to be in a trial a few years ago, but it was too far away and I didn't make it. And then the second time was I was too sick. So how much time do they have for trials? Because now I see the drug on TV and they're already using it, but it has a lot of side effects that they didn't talk about. So do you know about how long they do the trial and then it's on TV, the drug?
Well, so to answer your first question, we try to not deny essential care to people in order to get them on a clinical trial. We try not to deny or delay. So, you know, I'm sorry to hear that in your case, it sounds like there was a delay. If a patient has to wait a long time to get onto a trial, I'll tell them, we can't wait. Let's do the treatment that we need to do. And I wish every doctor, you know, had that prerogative, because while clinical trials are really great treatment and get us our next great drug approved, we need to be ethical, and we can't keep patients waiting. So we need to do better on streamlining so patients can start clinical trials quickly without delay. But a lot of clinical trials will allow you to start something that's considered to be essential while you're getting worked up, so that we can try to not delay the care, but still get you on the trial. And then how long does it take from the time it's in a trial to it's FDA approved? That's very variable. And probably the number one thing that determines that is how quickly patients enroll. So when there's a really exciting drug that people already have the feeling that it works, we can fill 1,000 patient clinical trial in a year or two and get that drug into everybody's hands so anyone can use it much faster. But if the clinical trial doesn't enroll subjects, it can take 5 years, 6 years, and that means it's that much longer until it gets FDA approved. So some of it is in the design of the trials, but some of it is just in whether patients buy in and enroll.
Okay, thank you.
So I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. One important point, I think, that some people are afraid to go onto a trial because they think they will lose some rights, they'll lose some control. But actually, when you're on a trial, you and your doctor maintain the control and the ability to make decisions. So if you start a clinical trial and you have a bad side effect, you're not obligated to continue. You can stop. Even if you just change your mind, even if you never got that first dose, or you got it and you didn't have a bad reaction, but you just don't want to do it anymore. you maintain your rights, and you and your doctor, as part of the clinical trial, will make decisions together about, should we do the dose today? Should we lower it? Should we skip it? Just the same way you would as if you're not on a clinical trial. We also try to share information, as we already addressed this. And if we find out something new during a clinical trial, like let's say it's a phase 3 and half the patients are getting drug X and half are getting drug Y. If we find out the drug X is much better, we stop the trial, we tell everyone, and usually there's a way for you to get the better drug if you are on the other arm. So let's see. We've covered a lot of this. We talked a little bit about cost. Yeah, so a second opinion, another thing I hear from patients is, maybe they want to get another opinion about, should I just do the standard treatment or is there a clinical trial, but they're worried their doctor will be offended. And in my view, no doctor should have that much ego, right? If a patient of mine says, hey, I want to go to UCLA and see what they've got, or hear their opinion on the trial you just offered me versus the standard treatment, I'm totally okay with it, because I don't think I have a monopoly on all the knowledge. And I'm very open to hearing what my colleagues think. I always think 2 heads are better than 1. Sometimes it can get confusing. You go for a second opinion and it's different. You have to be prepared for that. Sometimes that then leads to some discomfort, because then you're like, whoa, well, what's the right answer if these 2 doctors have 2 different opinions? But there's often more than one right answer, and people can view the same data in different ways. But just be aware of these kinds of things when you're thinking about a second opinion. Your doctor should not be offended, and you may get a different answer, and then you just have to kind of go with whoever, I guess, you trust more, or whatever logic is explained to you in a way that resonates more. So as I said, my patients who go on clinical trials are my heroes. I do think they're getting the best care. They get an extra layer of support in terms of the clinical trial team. They're really, at a place like City of Hope, where that's our mission, that's what we do. We really try to prioritize and expedite and make it as easy an experience as possible, recognizing that it's probably never an easy experience to be on a trial, or get cancer treatment more generally, but we really try to make it as streamlined and easy and supportive as possible. And as I said, when we get results, like let's say one drug's better than the other, we will tell you. We won't keep you on the treatment that's not as good. We also try to circle back when a trial is all done and it's been presented at a big national meeting and FDA is going to potentially approve the drug. We try to go back and tell the people who were in the trial, hey, this thing you did, I got this drug approved, like you contributed to this. As a way to circle back. Or if the trial was negative, well, we had hoped this treatment was better. Turns out it was about the same. But still your participation gave us that answer. And people often join clinical trials because they feel like cancer is a terrible thing to have happen to a person, and at least something kind of for the greater good, something bigger can come out of participation in a trial. But it's also totally okay to not do a trial. There are lots of patients who I love who are not getting treatment on clinical trial. It just doesn't always work out, and it's not always the right fit for someone, and that's okay too. So I would encourage you, if you're on a good treatment, that's great. You don't need a clinical trial, but if you're getting to a juncture where you're thinking about moving to a new treatment, consider asking your doctor, consider looking at clinicaltrials.gov or seeking out a second opinion, because there are really, really great new treatments in the pipeline that are very exciting. And I think I will end it there. I'll stop sharing and then we can answer any last questions people have. Did I manage to stop?
It looks like you stopped the presenter mode, but I can stop the
Stop
sharing.
share. Let me see.
Here we go. There we go.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dorff. I just want to open it up to the group. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute your audio or use the chat.
Not, that's okay. You guys asked some good questions during, which I think works well.
I think you tackled a lot of misconceptions too. Just general knowledge of clinical trials, what they are and kind of how they come to be. It was also really validating to hear that it is difficult to find them. I know as a former IRB manager, kind of when the new laws came out requiring researchers to put their clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, that meant a lot, just as far as making clinical trials more accessible. But it's still really difficult to find. And so I think that was really validating to hear that.
Yeah, and use the filters. You know, if you want to join a clinical trial, they're going to show you trials that are already done and trials that haven't opened yet. So you can use filters like recruiting. That means it's actually open and you could go on it. So I often, because I'll do clinicaltrials.gov searches for my patients in the room just to see what else is around. So I'll make sure I click that filter and then that narrows my search.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Just thank you very much. I understand I have a rare blood issue, polycythemia vera, which I guess I figured since I was working with an oncologist and on chemotherapy every day that it would be a cancer, but typically it's not cancer, I guess. But I always ask my oncologist if there's a clinical trial, and none that she's aware of. And having this web link now that we can go and, you know, kind of self-advocate to see. But I know it all works out into funding. So there's evidently not enough people that under my umbrella that, you know, it would fund. But I appreciate so much all that you do and for all the people. My husband actually was in a study for prostate cancer at UCLA and, you know, did great so far, survival rates ongoing. So that was great.
Yeah, the small diseases, the rarer diseases, it is harder to find funding and interest in clinical trials, but I think that's changing slowly.
Good.
Because every
Well, I think people advocate for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As an advocate for clinical trials, I wonder, Dr. Dorff, are there any clinical trials that you're just really excited about right now? It could be obviously one of yours you're very excited about, but are there any others that you've heard about that you're looking forward to seeing the results?
I mean, there's a million of them. I think generally my interest is immunotherapy, because I believe our immune systems are incredibly powerful. And if we just figure out how to activate them, that is how we will get long-lasting remissions or even cures. And that's been true in some of the blood cancers like leukemia. It's been true in cancers like melanoma and kidney cancer. So City of Hope does a lot of immunotherapy trials, and there's so many different ways to activate the immune system. And each cancer really seems to require almost a different way, although there's some overlap and some drugs work in multiple cancers. But there's also this new field of radioligand therapy. So, you know, some of you may have had a PET scan. So they can make a PET scan that looks for a specific protein. And if your cancer has that protein, then they can use something that's very similar to the PET scan dye that they inject, but that can kill the cancer cell when it gets there. So you scan to show that the treatment could find the cancer, and then you give the treatment to treat the cancer. So they call it a theranostic, a therapeutic and a diagnostic. And it's a form of radiation, but it's going through the bloodstream, like from the inside to the cancer. So we have a lot of clinical trials with different proteins that might find different cancers with the same sort of treatment concept, which is a radiation particle coming from the inside that's being specifically delivered to the cancer. So I think you'll see a lot more of those trials too across cancer types.
Mm.
Thank you so much. I mean, one of the reasons why we so appreciate these opportunities to spend time with you, and thank you for spending an hour of your evening with us, is to be able to have these conversations directly with physicians and to hear about kind of the latest advances in treatment. It's such a privilege. So thank you so much. Regarding PET scans, someone had a question of how small can the cancer be detected?
Most PET scans, like your standard, can only be considered reliable in a tumor that's a centimeter or larger. But there are some PET scans for prostate cancer that can see it when it's 3 millimeters. And I'm sure that's going to become the case for other diseases as well. But yeah, it's hard because there's an amount of cancer that is too small for us to see. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know someone's cancer is back until we can see it. So it's definitely a field of research, better imaging that can see the cancer.
It's okay.
3 millimeters is really promising.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for your time and for sharing your stories. Thank you, Dr. Dorff. We'll go ahead and give you 9 minutes of your night back. Thank you so much for making time for us and just sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. We really appreciate you.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you for your time. Thank you very much.